I stood there watching strangers install a fence around my family's lake. The lake where my grandfather taught me to fish. The lake where I scattered my mother's ashes just 2 years ago. The workers hammered "no trespassing" signs into the ground like they were marking graves. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone to call the police. But before I could dial, I heard sirens approaching. Margaret, my HOA president neighbor, was already on the phone. She pointed at me with her manicured finger and told the officer, "That man is trespassing on community property. I have the documents right here." The officer looked at her paperwork, then he looked at me. "Sir, I need you to step back from the fence." I felt my world crumble as I realized the truth. This woman had somehow stolen my lake right from under me. But what I did not know yet was that her greed would cost her everything. My name is David, and for 32 years I lived what most people would call a perfect life. Every morning I woke up to the sound of water lapping against the shore of Crystal Lake, not some public beach or crowded resort. My lake, my family's lake. My grandfather bought this land in 1962 when it was nothing but wilderness and a natural spring that had formed into a pristine lake over centuries. He built our family home with his own hands, positioning it perfectly to capture the sunrise over the water each morning. When he passed, the property went to my father. When my father died 5 years ago, it came to me. The lake was not just water and land. It was where 3 generations of my family had created memories. Summer barbecues with friends gathered around the shore. Quiet evenings fishing as the sun painted the sky orange and pink. Winter mornings when the surface froze into a perfect mirror that reflected the snow-covered trees. I had my morning routine down to an art. Coffee on the back deck at sunrise, checking the weather, maybe catching a bass or two before heading to work at my consulting business. Weekends meant friends coming over for lake days that stretched into starlit nights around the fire pit. Life was peaceful, life was good. Then Margaret moved in next door. Margaret Patterson was the kind of woman who introduced herself by listing her credentials. Former corporate executive, MBA from some prestigious school, and within 6 months of moving to our quiet neighborhood, she had somehow gotten herself elected as HOA president. Our HOA had always been pretty relaxed. We had basic rules about keeping properties maintained and not parking boats in the street. Most of us barely thought about it, but Margaret had different ideas. She started showing up at my property for what she called community wellness inspections. She would walk around with a clipboard, taking notes about my landscaping, my dock, even the color of my outdoor furniture. "David," she would say in her sweet but sharp voice, "we need to maintain certain standards in this community. Property values, you understand." I tried to be polite. I explained that my property had been grandfathered in long before the HOA existed. My dock, my landscaping, even my house had been here decades before any of the newer homes were built. Margaret would smile and nod, but I could see something calculating behind her eyes, something that made me uncomfortable. Then she got engaged to Richard Hawthorne, a developer who owned a construction company on the other side of town. Richard was the kind of man who looked at everything like a potential business opportunity. Within weeks of their engagement, I noticed them both spending a lot of time staring at my lake from their back deck. Margaret started making comments about community wellness and how the lake could benefit everyone in the neighborhood. She suggested I should consider opening it up for responsible community use. When I politely declined, her tone changed. The friendly neighbor act disappeared, replaced by someone who spoke about regulations and community standards like they were weapons. I should have seen the warning signs. I should have known that when someone like Margaret sets their eyes on something they want, they do not just give up and walk away. The night I found her in my backyard with a surveyor and a handful of official-looking documents, I knew my peaceful life was about to become a war. The harassment started small, like drops of poison in a well that you do not notice until the water tastes bitter. Margaret filed her first official complaint 3 days after I caught her with the surveyor. The violation notice arrived in my mailbox on a Tuesday morning, printed on official HOA letterhead. Property maintenance violation. Dock extends beyond acceptable waterline boundaries. Unauthorized structure requiring immediate compliance review. I read it twice, thinking it had to be a mistake. My dock had been in the same spot for over 20 years. My father had built it to the exact specifications required by the county, and we had all the permits to prove it. But when I called Margaret to discuss it, her voice had taken on a cold, professional tone. "David, I understand this property has sentimental value for you, but we have to follow proper procedures. The community has standards now." 2 days later, Richard showed up at my front door. He was not alone. Margaret was with him, carrying another clipboard and wearing what I would learn to recognize as her official business smile. "We are here for the community assessment," she announced, walking past me into my yard without invitation. "Assessment for what?" I asked, following them toward the lake. "HOA property evaluation," Richard said, pulling out a measuring tape. "We need to determine the exact boundaries of community-accessible areas." I watched him measure my dock, my shoreline, even the distance from my house to the water. Margaret took photos of everything, including my boat, my fire pit, and the small fishing shed my grandfather had built in the 1970s. "You cannot just come onto my property and measure things," I said, feeling my temperature rise. Margaret looked up from her clipboard. "Actually, according to Section 12 of the HOA bylaws, we have inspection rights for community wellness evaluations." I had never heard of Section 12. That night, I dug out my copy of the original HOA agreement. There was no Section 12 about community wellness, but when I went online to check the current bylaws on the HOA website, there it was, newly added, recently updated. Margaret had been busy. The violation notices started coming weekly. Unauthorized outdoor lighting, excessive noise during evening hours, improper waste disposal. Each one was more ridiculous than the last, but each one required a response, a hearing, a formal process that consumed my time and peace of mind. Margaret organized an emergency HOA board meeting to discuss community lake access rights. She had somehow convinced 3 other board members that the lake should be considered a natural community resource, available for neighborhood use. I attended that meeting with a folder full of property deeds, surveys, and legal documents proving my ownership. Margaret listened politely as I presented my case, nodding and taking notes. When I finished, she stood up and addressed the room. "While we all respect David's emotional attachment to this property, we have to consider what is best for the entire community. This lake represents a valuable wellness resource that could benefit all of our families." The room murmured agreement. I looked around at my neighbors, people I had known for years, and saw them nodding along with Margaret's words. "The lake should not be hoarded by one family when it could serve the greater good," Margaret continued. "I propose we research the legal options for community management of this natural resource." I felt my chest tighten. It is not a community resource. It is my property. I have the deed right here. Margaret smiled that sweet, sharp smile. Deeds can be complicated, David. Sometimes what people think they own is not exactly what they actually own. After the meeting, I cornered Margaret in the parking lot. "What exactly are you trying to do here?" I asked. She looked at me with those calculating eyes, no longer bothering to hide her intentions. "I am trying to do what is best for this community, David. And sometimes that means making hard decisions about resources that are being wasted." As she walked to her car, she turned back one more time. "That lake belongs to this community, whether you realize it or not." That night I could not sleep. I stood on my deck, looking out at the water that had been in my family for 60 years, and felt like I was looking at it for the last time. I had no idea how right I was. Margaret moved fast, faster than I ever imagined possible. 3 weeks after her declaration at the HOA meeting, I received a certified letter that made my blood run cold. It was not another violation notice. It was an official notice of community asset transfer under emergency authority. The letter claimed that due to recent boundary surveys and community safety assessments, Crystal Lake had been determined to fall within the HOA's Common Area Management Authority. Effective immediately, the lake would be managed by the HOA board for the benefit of all community members. I called my attorney that same day, but he was out of town for a family emergency. His assistant said he would call me back in a week. A week felt like forever. The next morning, I understood why Margaret had moved so quickly. I was in my kitchen making coffee when I heard machinery, heavy machinery. I ran outside and saw 3 trucks parked along the road by my property line. Workers were unloading posts, fencing materials, and official-looking signs. Margaret stood in my driveway, clipboard in hand, directing the operation like a general commanding troops. "What is going on here?" I shouted, running toward the workers. "Community Improvement Project," Margaret called back. "We are securing the perimeter of the community lake access area." I watched in horror as the workers began installing a chain-link fence between my house and the lake. They were literally cutting me off from my own water. "You cannot do this," I said, grabbing one of the workers by the arm. "This is my property." The worker, a tired-looking man in his 50s, looked uncomfortable. "Look, buddy, I just do what I am told. You need to talk to the lady with the clipboard." Margaret walked over, holding a thick folder of documents. "David, I understand this is difficult for you, but we have legal authority here. The recent survey determined that the lake boundaries fall within community common area jurisdiction." "What survey? I never authorized any survey." She pulled out an official-looking document with county letterhead. "This survey was conducted under HOA Emergency Assessment Authority. The results clearly show boundary discrepancies in the original property deeds." I grabbed the document and stared at it. The signatures looked real. The measurements looked official. But something felt wrong. The boundaries shown in the survey were completely different from every survey I had ever seen of my property. "This is impossible," I said. "My family has owned this land for 60 years." "Sometimes old surveys contain errors," Margaret said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Modern GPS technology is much more accurate." As we argued, the workers continued installing the fence. They hammered "No trespassing" signs into the ground every 50 feet. "Community lake access, HOA members only." I felt sick watching them. This was not just about property boundaries. This was theft. Plain and simple theft, dressed up in legal paperwork and community authority. That afternoon, Richard showed up with an architect and an engineer. They spent 2 hours walking around the lake, taking measurements, making sketches, and having excited conversations about development potential and community enhancements. I tried to confront them, but Margaret appeared like magic. "David, I need you to stay behind the fence line. This is now a restricted work area." "Work area for what?" "Community improvements. We are planning a beautiful lakefront park with picnic areas, maybe a small pavilion for community events. Richard has some wonderful ideas for making this space accessible to everyone." The pieces clicked together in my mind. This was not about community wellness. This was about Richard's development business. Margaret had stolen my lake to give to her fiancé as a development project. I pulled out my phone to call the police, but Margaret was already dialing. "Yes, I need officers at 1247 Pine Ridge Drive. We have someone trespassing on community property and interfering with authorized work." I could not believe what I was hearing. "I am not trespassing. This is my property." Margaret held up her folder of documents. "Actually, according to these surveys and boundary assessments, you are currently standing on HOA common area land." When the police arrived, Margaret presented her paperwork like she was holding royal decrees. The officers looked at her documents, then looked at me. "Sir, do you have proof of ownership for this specific area?" the lead officer asked. I pulled out my property deed, but it suddenly felt inadequate compared to Margaret's thick folder of surveys, assessments, and official letters. "This seems like a civil property dispute," the officer said. "You are going to need to resolve this through the courts, but for now, I need you to step back behind the fence line." As the officers escorted me away from my own lake, I felt something break inside me. I had been outmaneuvered, outdocumented, and outlawyered by a woman who had decided she wanted my family's land. But as I watched Margaret smile triumphantly from behind the fence she had built around my inheritance, I made a decision that would change everything. This was not over, not by a long shot. I did not sleep for 3 days after they fenced off my lake. I spent those nights researching property law, calling attorneys, and trying to understand how someone could steal 60 years of family ownership with a stack of papers and some fake authority. On Thursday morning, I finally reached James Mitchell, a property attorney who specialized in land disputes and HOA conflicts. When I explained my situation, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Mr. Thompson, what you are describing sounds like fraud, serious fraud. Can you bring me all your property documents and any paperwork this Margaret person has filed?" That afternoon, I sat in James's office with every piece of paper related to my property spread across his conference table. Deeds, surveys, tax records, permit applications going back to my grandfather's original purchase in 1962. James studied Margaret's survey documents with a magnifying glass, comparing them line by line with my original property surveys. "These signatures are forged," he said finally, "and these boundary measurements are completely fabricated. Whoever created these documents did a decent job, but they made several critical errors." My heart started beating again for the first time in days. "So I can get my lake back." "We can definitely fight this. But first, we need to understand who we are dealing with. This level of document forgery suggests this is not Margaret's first time pulling something like this." James hired a private investigator named Sarah Chen, a former police detective who specialized in property fraud cases. Within a week, Sarah came back with information that made my blood boil. Margaret Patterson had been involved in similar schemes in 3 other states over the past 8 years. She would move into communities, get elected to HOA boards, and then use her position to acquire valuable properties through legal manipulation and document fraud. In Colorado, she had convinced an elderly man to donate his waterfront cabin to the community for tax benefits, then immediately sold it to a developer. In Arizona, she had used forged environmental assessments to force a family to sell their desert property at below market value. In each case, she disappeared before anyone could take legal action. But this time was different. This time, she had gotten engaged to Richard Hawthorne, which meant she was planning to stay put, and that gave us the opportunity to build a case against her. Sarah's investigation into Richard revealed even more disturbing information. His development company was in serious financial trouble. He owed over $2 million to various creditors and was facing bankruptcy within 6 months if he could not find a major project to save his business. My lakefront property was worth approximately $4 million as a development site. It was not just valuable to Richard, it was his lifeline. They are not just stealing your property for fun, Sarah explained. They are stealing it because Richard's entire business depends on it. That makes this conspiracy to commit fraud, which is a federal crime. Armed with this information, James filed emergency motions to stop all work on my property and demanded a full investigation into Margaret's fraudulent documents. We submitted the evidence of forged signatures, falsified surveys, and Margaret's history of similar crimes in other states. The judge granted our emergency injunction within 48 hours. Work on the lake development had to stop immediately, and Margaret had to remove the fencing until the property ownership could be legally determined. I thought this would end Margaret's scheme. I was wrong. Instead of backing down, she escalated her harassment to levels I never imagined possible. She called the police on me every single day, claiming I was trespassing, making noise violations, or threatening community safety. The officers got tired of the calls pretty quickly, but Margaret always had new complaints, new violations, new reasons why I was a danger to the community. She organized neighborhood meetings where she painted me as an unstable property hoarder who was using expensive lawyers to steal community resources. She convinced several neighbors to sign petitions supporting the Community Lake Project. But Sarah's investigation was just getting started. She discovered that Margaret and Richard had already begun taking deposits from potential investors for their lake development project. They had sold shares in a luxury lakefront community that they did not actually own. The amount of money they had already collected from investors was staggering. Over $1.2 million in deposits for properties and amenities that existed only in Richard's architectural drawings. This is not just fraud anymore, James told me during one of our strategy meetings. This is wire fraud, securities fraud, and criminal conspiracy. Margaret and Richard have committed federal crimes. As we gathered evidence for our case, I realized that my personal fight for my family's lake had become something much bigger. Margaret had not just targeted me. She had created an elaborate criminal enterprise designed to steal property and defraud investors. But the most shocking discovery was still to come. Sarah found records showing that Margaret had been researching my property for over a year before she moved to the neighborhood. Her entire move, her HOA election, even her relationship with Richard, had all been carefully planned as part of an elaborate scheme to steal my lake. I was not a random victim. I had been specifically targeted, researched, and hunted by professional criminals who saw my family's inheritance as their retirement plan. That night, as I sat on what remained of my unfenced dock, I realized that this was not just about getting my property back anymore. This was about making sure Margaret and Richard paid for every crime they had committed and ensuring they could never do this to another family again. The war was just beginning. James filed our comprehensive lawsuit on a Monday morning in October. The document was 47 pages long and included charges of fraud, conspiracy, theft, document forgery, and racketeering under federal RICO statutes. We were not just suing Margaret and Richard. We were suing their construction company, the fraudulent surveying company they had used, and every entity involved in their criminal enterprise. Margaret and Richard responded by hiring Kellerman, Brooks and Associates, one of the most expensive law firms in the state. Their lead attorney, Marcus Kellerman, had a reputation for defending wealthy clients against fraud charges using aggressive tactics and unlimited resources. The legal bills started piling up immediately. Kellerman's strategy was simple: bury us in paperwork, drag out every procedure, and make the cost of fighting too expensive for us to continue. But they made one critical mistake. They underestimated how much evidence we had gathered, and they had no idea that Sarah Chen was still investigating their other crimes. The media attention started when a local reporter picked up the court filings. HOA president accused of million-dollar property theft ran as the headline in the county newspaper. Within days, the story had spread to regional news stations. Margaret tried to control the narrative by giving interviews where she portrayed herself as a community volunteer, being attacked by a greedy property owner who wanted to keep public resources for himself. David Thompson is using expensive lawyers to prevent this community from accessing natural resources that should belong to everyone, she told Channel 7 News. This lake could provide recreation and wellness opportunities for dozens of families, but he wants to keep it all to himself. But the media attention had an unexpected benefit. Other victims of Margaret's schemes started coming forward. A retired teacher from Colorado called Sarah Chen after seeing the news story. Margaret had convinced her to donate her mountain cabin to a community land trust for tax benefits, then immediately sold it to a developer for 3 times its assessed value. A veteran from Arizona contacted us with documents showing how Margaret had used fraudulent environmental reports to force him to sell his ranch at a huge loss. She had claimed his property was contaminated, then bought it through a shell company for 20 cents on the dollar. With each new victim who came forward, our case against Margaret grew stronger. This was not an isolated incident. This was a pattern of criminal behavior spanning nearly a decade. The discovery phase of our lawsuit became like an archaeological expedition into Margaret's criminal history. We uncovered layers of shell companies, forged documents, and financial transactions that painted a picture of systematic fraud. Margaret's depositions were particularly revealing. Under oath, she tried to maintain her story about community wellness and property boundary disputes. But when confronted with evidence of forged signatures and falsified surveys, her answers became increasingly contradictory. "I do not recall signing those documents," she would say about papers with her signature on them. "I was not involved in the boundary survey," she claimed, despite emails showing her directing the surveyor to alter the measurements. Her lies were falling apart under legal scrutiny, but she kept digging herself deeper with each deposition. Richard's depositions were even more damaging. Unlike Margaret, he was not a skilled liar. When confronted with evidence of the investor deposits, he broke down and admitted that they had been taking money from people for a development project they did not own. "Margaret told me the lake transfer was legal," he said during one particularly damaging session. She showed me all the paperwork. I thought everything was legitimate. But financial records showed that Richard had been involved in planning the fraud from the beginning. He had ordered architectural drawings for the lake development 2 months before Margaret filed her first property complaint against me. Meanwhile, Margaret's harassment campaign continued. She filed complaints with the county health department, claiming my property was a public safety hazard. She reported me to the EPA for alleged water contamination. She even called Adult Protective Services, claiming I was an unstable elderly person who needed supervision. Each false report required time and energy to refute, but they also created more evidence of Margaret's malicious behavior. The breaking point came when Sarah Chen discovered that Margaret had been attempting to intimidate witnesses. She had approached 2 former HOA board members who were planning to testify about her manipulation tactics, offering them money to change their testimony. Witness intimidation was a serious crime that could result in additional federal charges, but it also showed how desperate Margaret was becoming as the evidence mounted against her. In a final act of desperation, Margaret broke into the county recorder's office after hours and attempted to destroy the original property records that proved my family's ownership of the lake. She was caught on security cameras using bolt cutters to break into file cabinets and shredding documents. The night security guard found her with a briefcase full of property deeds and surveys, including the original 1962 documents from my grandfather's purchase. Margaret was arrested on charges of breaking and entering, destruction of public records, and tampering with evidence. But for me, her arrest felt like justice finally beginning to catch up with her crimes. The trial was set for January. After 8 months of legal warfare, we would finally get our day in court. The courthouse was packed on the first day of trial. Local media, curious neighbors, Margaret's previous victims, and even some of Richard's defrauded investors filled every seat in the gallery. Margaret sat at the defense table in a conservative blue suit, looking every inch the respectable community volunteer she pretended to be. Richard fidgeted nervously beside her, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Our legal team had prepared for this moment for months. James Mitchell opened with a presentation that methodically destroyed every aspect of Margaret's fraud scheme. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," James began, "this case is about greed disguised as community service. It is about 2 people who decided that they could steal a family's 60-year legacy through lies, forged documents, and abuse of authority." He clicked through a slideshow showing the original 1962 property deed, followed by Margaret's forged survey documents. The differences were obvious even to non-lawyers. The defendants did not just lie about property boundaries. They created an elaborate criminal enterprise designed to steal valuable land and defraud investors. They targeted David Thompson's family property specifically because it was worth millions of dollars, and they believed they could take it without consequences. The evidence presentation took 3 days. We showed the jury forged signatures, falsified surveys, and financial records proving that Margaret and Richard had collected over $1.2 million from investors for property they did not own. Sarah Chen testified about Margaret's pattern of similar crimes in other states. Each previous victim took the stand to tell their story of how Margaret had manipulated them out of their property, using the same tactics she had tried on me. The retired teacher from Colorado broke down in tears as she described losing her family's mountain cabin. "I trusted her," she said. "She seemed so professional, so official. I never imagined someone would lie about something so important. When Margaret finally took the stand in her own defense, the courtroom tension was electric. Her attorney had clearly coached her extensively, but under cross-examination, her carefully rehearsed answers began to crumble. James started with simple questions about the HOA bylaws and Margaret's authority as president. "Mrs. Patterson, show me in the original HOA agreement where it grants authority for property boundary reassessment." Margaret shuffled through papers, clearly stalling. "It is covered under the general welfare provisions." "I see. And where exactly does it mention lakes or water rights?" "Well, it is implied in the community wellness sections." James pulled up the original HOA document on the courtroom screen. "Mrs. Patterson, there is no section about community wellness in the original agreement. That section was added after you were elected president, was it not?" Margaret's composure started to crack. "I do not recall the exact timeline." "You do not recall adding an entire section to the HOA bylaws that gave you authority to claim community property." "I may have been involved in updating the bylaws for clarity." The cross-examination continued for 2 brutal days. James methodically confronted Margaret with every forged document, every false statement, and every contradictory claim she had made. When shown security footage of her breaking into the county recorder's office, Margaret claimed she was trying to research property records to help resolve the dispute. "Mrs. Patterson, you used bolt cutters to break into locked file cabinets. How does that help resolve a dispute?" "I was trying to find the truth." "By destroying public records." Margaret's voice rose defensively. Those records were keeping the community from accessing their rightful property. That statement was the turning point. Margaret had just admitted under oath that she believed the lake belonged to the community, despite all evidence to the contrary. Richard's testimony was even more damaging. Unlike Margaret, he was not skilled at maintaining lies under pressure. He admitted that they had taken investor deposits before securing ownership of the property. "We were confident the property transfer would be completed,"